Hello, and welcome back to Read Aloud, where we read and discuss Marxist and other adjacent texts. This is Read Aloud with Dan. That's me. Today on Read Aloud, we'll be reading Chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State, from Vladimir Lenin's The State and Revolution. We previously discussed and read some background on the State and Revolution, so if this is your first reading through that, you may find that to be interesting. Something else happened in the course of our study of this text is that we learned that Vladimir Lenin's older brother was arrested and executed for allegedly plotting to assassinate the you know what, I'm already forgetting his name. Some czar dude, right? Anyone got this? Alex the Third. Thank you, Chad. He was executed for planning an assassination of Alexander the Third of Russia, who was emperor. And this happened when Lenin was about 17 years old. His older brother was 21. Lenin was 17. And allegedly that led to some of the radicalization of Lenin as he, searched for answers. I thought that was fascinating. I wanted to share that with you. Today, we're going to read Chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State. In this chapter, in this first chapter, and what I'll do here is read from a website that I'm not necessarily saying that you should be reading from, but I found this summary to be helpful. A summary of the first chapter in the first chapter of The State and Revolution. Our guy, Lenin, he lays out the foundation for the rest of his arguments by letting Marx and Engels, pictured here, I'm sorry, that's obviously not the Marx and Engels, just having a good time, some technical difficulties, having a good time. Marx and Engels. Sorry, guys, this is my first stream. I've only seen it in the movies. Marx and Engels, pictured here, speak for themselves on the origin and role of the state in society. Setting out a number of key quotes from Engels' The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, and Anti-Dühring, Lenin draws out the basic tenets of the Marxist position on the state in opposition to the distortions of the opportunists, such as Karl Kautsky. Splitting the chapter into 4 sections, Lenin sets out the following fundamental conclusions: that the state arose out of the division of society into classes, that it exists in order to impose the order of the ruling possessor class over the exploited masses and not to reconcile the contending classes in society, that it relies on armed force to carry out this function, that in seizing power the proletariat abolishes this state and replaces it with the dictatorship of the proletariat, the fate of which is to wither away as class antagonisms are done away with, and that this is impossible without a violent revolution. Okay, so yeah, you have classes. The way that society is made today makes it so that the reconciliation of those classes doesn't happen. It precludes that. And the only way to get over that hump, I hate to say it, is violence. But we didn't make that so. They did. This is impossible without a violent revolution. If you want classes to go away, They've made it so that the conditions are so that you need a violent revolution to get rid of those class antagonisms. We didn't make it this way. They did. Keep that in mind. It is, reading on this basis, on the basis of these ideas, these key ideas rather, which Lenin goes on to analyze the historical experiences of other revolutions and further develop his position on the state. It is also precisely these ideas which constitute the dividing line between revolutionary Marxism and reformism. And I'm telling you, if you're from where I'm from, calling someone a reformist is a diss. That hurts. Bruh. Okay, so that's a little summary there. I'd like to now get into the reading. Chapter 1. Class Society and the State. Section 1. The State. A product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. Seems like we should remember that one. Lenin says, what is happening now to Marx's theory has, in the course of history, happened repeatedly to the theories of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes fighting for emancipation. During the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice, the most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their death, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hallow their names to a certain extent for the consolation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. Please don't do that, Lenin says. Don't do that. Today, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement concur in this doctoring of Marxism. They omit, obscure, or distort the revolutionary side of this theory, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now Marxists. Don't laugh. It's one of his best lines, by the way. And more frequently, German bourgeois scholars, only yesterday specialists in the annihilation of Marxism, are speaking of the national German Marx, who they claim educated the labor unions, which are so splendidly organized for the purpose of waging a predatory war. In these circumstances, in view of the unprecedentedly widespread distortion of Marxism, our main task is to reestablish what Marx really thought on the subject of the state. This will necessitate a number of long quotations from the works of Marx and Engels themselves. Of course, long quotations will render the text cumbersome and not help at all to make it popular reading, but we cannot possibly dispense with them. All, or at any rate all the most essential passages in the works of Marx and Engels on the subject of the state must by all means be quoted as fully as possible, so that the reader may form an independent opinion of the totality of the views of the founders of scientific socialism, and of the evolution of those views, so that their distortion by the Kautskyism now prevailing may be documentarily proved and clearly demonstrated. Let us begin with the most popular of Engels' works, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, the 6th edition of which was published in Stuttgart as far back as 1894. We have to translate the quotations from the German originals, as the Russian translations, while very numerous, or are for the most part either incomplete or very unsatisfactory. Let me change this. Summing up his historical analysis, Engels says, "The state, therefore, by no means a power forced on society from without, just as little as it is the reality of the ethical idea, the image and the reality of reason, as Hegel maintains. Rather, it is a product of society at a certain stage of development." Again, the state is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that it has split into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves and society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power, seemingly standing above society, that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power, arisen out of society, but placing itself above it, and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state. This expresses with perfect clarity the basic idea of Marxism with regard to the historical role and the meaning of the state. The state is a product and a manifestation of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. The state arises where, when, and insofar as class antagonism objectively cannot be reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state proves that the class antagonisms are irreconcilable. It is on this most important and fundamental point that the distortion of Marxism, proceeding along two main lines, begins. That's it. That's what the state is. That's the role of the state. And that's why, under the state, or where and when the state arises, it arises because those antagonisms cannot be reconciled. And personally, I'd like for them to be I'd like to reconcile. This ain't it. Reading on. On the one hand, the bourgeois, and particularly the petty bourgeois, ideologists, compelled under the weight of indisputable historical facts to admit that the state only exists where there are class antagonisms and a class struggle, correct Marx in such a way as to make it appear that the state is an organ for the reconciliation of classes. Is it? No, it's not. According to Marx, the state could neither have arisen nor maintained itself if it had been possible to reconcile classes. From what the petty bourgeois and Philistine professors and publicists say, with quite frequent and benevolent references to Marx, it appears that the state does reconcile classes. According to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of order, quote unquote, which legalizes and perpetuates this oppression by moderating the conflict between classes. In the opinion of the petty bourgeois politicians, however, order means the reconciliation of classes and not the oppression of one class by another. To alleviate the conflict means reconciling classes and not depriving the oppressed classes of definite means and methods of struggle to overthrow the oppressors. For instance, when, in the Revolution of 1917, the question of the significance and role of the state arose in all its magnitude as a practical question demanding immediate action and, moreover, action on a mass scale. All the social revolutionaries and Mensheviks descended at once to the petty bourgeois theory that the state reconciles classes. Innumerable resolutions and articles by politicians of both these parties are thoroughly saturated with this petty bourgeois and Philistine reconciliation theory. That the state is an organ of the rule of a definite class, which cannot be reconciled with its antipode, or the class opposite to it, is something the petty bourgeois Democrats will never be able to understand. Their attitude to the state is one of the most striking manifestations of the fact that our social revolutionaries and Mensheviks are not socialists at all, a point that we Bolsheviks have always maintained, but petty bourgeois Democrats using near-socialist phraseology. There are many such cases. This happens today. In 2025. On the other hand, the Kautskyite distortion of Marxism is far more subtle. Theoretically, it is not denied that the state is an organ of class rule or that class antagonisms are irreconcilable. But what is overlooked or glossed over is this. If the state is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, if it is a power standing above society and, quote, alienating itself more and more from it, it is clear that the liberation of the oppressed class is impossible not only without a violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the apparatus of state power which was created by the ruling class and which is the embodiment of this alienation. As we shall see later, Marx very explicitly drew this theoretically self-evident conclusion on the strength of a concrete historical analysis of the tasks of the revolution. And, as we shall show in further detail on, it is this conclusion which Kautsky has forgotten and distorted. Section 2. Special bodies of armed men, prisons, etc. Engels continues. As distinct from the old gentile, tribal or clan order, or Gentile, the state, first, divides its subject according to territory. This division seems natural to us, but it costs a prolonged struggle against the old organization according to generations or tribes. The second distinguishing feature is the establishment of a public power, which no longer directly coincides with the population organizing itself as an armed force. This special public power is necessary because a self-acting armed organization of the population has become impossible since the split into classes. This public power exists in every state. It consists not merely of armed men, but also of material adjuncts, prisons, and institutions of coercion of all kinds, of which the Gentile or clan society knew nothing. Engels elucidates the concept of the power which is called the state, a power which arose from society but places itself above it and alienates itself more and more from it. What does this power mainly consist of? It consists of special bodies of armed men having prisons, etc., at their command. It acts like a god, doesn't it? Lenin says, "We are justified in speaking of special bodies of armed men, because the public power which is an attribute of every state does not directly coincide with the armed population, with its self-acting armed organization." Like all great revolutionary thinkers, Engels tries to draw the attention of the class-conscious workers to what prevailing Philistinism regards as at least worthy of attention, as the most habitual thing, hallowed by prejudices that are not only deep-rooted, but, one might say, petrified. A standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power. But how can it be otherwise? From the viewpoint of the vast majority of Europeans of the end of the 19th century, whom Engels was addressing, and who had not gone through or closely observed a single great revolution, it could not have been otherwise. They could not understand at all what a self-acting armed organization of the population was. When asked why it became necessary to have special bodies of armed men placed above society and alienating themselves from it, the police and a standing army, the West European and Russian Philistines are inclined to utter a few phrases borrowed from Spencer or Mikhailovsky to refer to the growing complexion of social life, the differentiation of functions, and so on. Such a reference seems scientific and effectively lulls the ordinary person to sleep by obscuring the important and basic fact, namely, the split of society into irreconcilable antagonistic classes. Were it not for this split, the self-acting armed organization of the population would differ from the primitive organization of a stick-wielding herd of monkeys or primitive men, or of men united in clans by its complexity, its high technical level, and so on. But such an organization would still be impossible. It is impossible because civilized society is split into antagonistic and, moreover, irreconcilably antagonistic classes, whose self-acting arming would lead to an armed struggle between them. A state arises, a special power is created, special bodies of men, of armed men, and every revolution, by destroying the state apparatus, shows us the naked class struggle, clearly shows us how the ruling class strives to restore the special bodies of armed men, which serve it, and how the oppressed class strives to create a new organization of this kind, capable of serving the exploited instead of the exploiters. In the above argument, Engels raises theoretically the very same question which every great revolution raises before us in practice, palpably, and, what is more, on a scale of mass action, namely, the question of the relationship between special bodies of armed men and the self-acting armed organization of the population. We shall see how this question is specifically illustrated by the experience of the European and Russian revolutions. But to return to Engels's exposition, he points out that sometimes, in certain parts of North America, for example, This public power is weak. He has in mind a rare exception in capitalist society and those parts of North America in its pre-imperialist days where the free colonists predominated. Again, this public power is weak, but that generally speaking, it grows stronger, Engels says. It, the public power, grows stronger. However, in proportion as class antagonisms within the state become more acute, and as adjacent states become larger and more populous. We have only to look at our present-day Europe, where class struggle and rivalry in conquest have tuned up the public power to such a pitch that it threatens to swallow the whole of society and even the state. This was written not later than the early 90s of the last century, Engels' last preface being dated June 16, 1891. The turn towards imperialism, meaning the complete domination of the trusts, the omnipotence of the big banks, a grand-scale colonial policy, and so forth, was only just beginning in France, and was even weaker in North America and in Germany. Since then, rivalry in conquest has taken a gigantic stride, all the more because by the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, the world had been completely divided up among these rivals in conquest, id est, or that is, among the predatory great powers. Since then, military and naval armaments have grown fantastically in the predatory war of 1914 to 1917 for the domination of the world by Britain or Germany. For the division of the spoils has brought the swallowing of all the forces of society by the rapacious state power close to complete catastrophe. Engels could, as early as 1891, point to a rivalry in conquest as one of the most important distinguishing features of the foreign policy of the great powers, while the social chauvinist scoundrels have ever since 1914, when this rivalry, many times intensified, gave rise to an imperialist war, been covering up the defense of the predatory interests of their own bourgeoisie with the phrases about defense of the fatherland, defense of the republic and the revolution, etc. Section 3. The state, an instrument for the exploitation of the oppressed class. The maintenance of the special public power standing above society requires taxes and state loans. Having public power and the right to levy taxes, Engels writes, the officials now stand as organs of society above society. The free, voluntary respect that was accorded to the organs of the Gentile or clan constitution does not satisfy them, even if they could gain it. Special laws are enacted proclaiming the sanctity and immunity of the officials. The shabbiest police servant has more authority than the representative of the clan. But even the head of the military power of a civilized state may well envy the elder of a clan the unrestrained respect of society. Yep, that's exactly what Western leaders will never have. That's only found in other places. The question of the privileged position of the officials as organs of state power is raised here. The main point indicated is what is it that places them above society? What makes them think they can act like gods? We shall see how this theoretical question was answered in a practice by the Paris Commune in 1871, and how it was obscured from a reactionary standpoint by Kautsky in 1912. And I believe this is an Engels quote here. Quote, because the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, but because it arose at the same time in the midst of the conflict of these classes, it is, as a rule, the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class, which, through the medium of the state, becomes also the politically dominant class, and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. The ancient and feudal states were organs for the exploitation of the slaves and serfs. Likewise, quote, the modern representative state, is an instrument of exploitation of wage labor by capital. By way of exception, however, periods occur in which the warring classes balance each other so nearly that the state power as ostensible mediator acquires, for the moment, a certain degree of independence of both. Such were the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Bonapartism of the First and Second Empires in France, and the Bismarck regime in Germany. Such, we may add, is the Kerensky government in Republican Russia, since it began to persecute the revolutionary proletariat at a moment when, owing to the leadership of the petty bourgeois Democrats, the Soviets have already become impotent, while the bourgeoisie are not yet strong enough to simply disperse them. In a democratic republic, Engels continues, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but all the more surely. First, by means of direct corruption of officials, America. Secondly, by means of an alliance of the government and the stock exchange, France and America. At present, imperialism and the domination of the banks have developed into an exceptional art both these methods of upholding and giving effect to the omnipotence of wealth in democratic republics of all descriptions. Since, for instance, in the very first months of the Russian Democratic Republic, one might say during the honeymoon of the socialist, SRs and Mensheviks joined in wedlock to the bourgeoisie in the coalition government. Mr. Palczynski obstructed every measure intended for curbing the capitalists and their marauding practices, their plundering of the state by means of war contracts. And since later on Mr. Palczynski, upon resigning from the cabinet and being, of course, replaced by another quite similar Palczynski, was rewarded by the capitalists with a lucrative job with a salary of 120,000 rubles per annum. That sounds like a lot of money. What would you call that? Direct or indirect bribery? An alliance of the governments and the syndicates, or merely friendly relations? What role do the Chernovs, Tseretellis, Evksentsievs, and Skobelovs play? Nailed it. Are they the direct or only the indirect allies of the millionaire treasury looters? I think that's a good question. Another reason why the impotence of wealth is more certain in a democratic republic is that it does not depend on defects in the political machinery or on the faulty political shell of capitalism. A democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism, and therefore, once capital has gained possession of this very best shell, through the Palczynskis, Chernovs, Tseretellis and company, it establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no changes of persons institutions, or parties in the bourgeois democratic republic can shake it. We must also note that Engels is most explicit in calling universal suffrage as well an instrument of bourgeois rule. Universal suffrage, he says, obviously taking account of the long experience of German social democracy, is the gauge of the maturity of the working class. It cannot and never will be anything more in the present day state. That's all it is. It's a gauge. It's not a lever of power. It's a gauge. Remember that, because that is still very relevant today. In 2025, Lenin says, the petty bourgeois Democrats, such as our socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, and also their twin brothers, all the social chauvinists and opportunists of Western Europe, expect just this more from universal suffrage. They themselves share and instill into the minds of the people the false notion that universal suffrage in the present day state is really capable of revealing the will of the majority of the working people and of securing its realization. Here, we can only indicate this false notion, only point out that Engels' perfectly clear statement is distorted at every step in the propaganda and agitation of the official, that is, opportunist socialist parties. A detailed exposure of the utter falsity of this notion, which Engels brushes aside here, is given in our further account of the views of Marx and Engels on the present day state. Engels gives a general, hold on, I have to change this to scrolled. Engels gives a general summary of his views in the most popular of his works in the following words. The state, then, has not existed from all eternity. There have been societies that did without it, that had no idea of the state and state power. At a certain stage of economic development, which was necessarily bound up with the split of society into classes, the state became a necessity owing to this split. We are now rapidly approaching a stage in the development of production at which the existence of these classes not only will have ceased to be a necessity, but will become a positive hindrance to production. They will fall as they arose at an earlier stage. Along with them, the state will inevitably fall. Society, which will reorganize production on the basis of a free and equal association of the producers, the workers, the laborers, will put the whole machinery of state where it will then belong, into a museum of antiquities, by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. I sort of thought he was going to say that dust hole of history line. I always loved that line too. Lenin says, we do not often come across this passage in the propaganda and agitation literature of the present-day social democrats. Even when we do come across it, it is mostly quoted in the same manner as one bows before an icon. That is, it's done to show official respect for Engels, and no attempt is made to gauge the breadth and depth of the revolution that this relegating of the whole machinery of state to a museum of antiquities implies. In most cases, we do not even find an understanding of what Engels calls the state machine. Section 4. the withering away of the state and violent revolution. Engels's words regarding the withering away of the state are so widely known that they are often quoted and so clearly reveal the essence of the customary adaptation of Marxism to opportunism that we must deal with them in detail. We shall quote the whole argument from which they are taken. Oh, this is a big long quote. Here. Quote, the proletariat, let me say that again. Engels says, the proletariat seizes from state power and turns the means of production into state property to begin with. But thereby, it abolishes itself as the proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, and also abolishes the state as state. Society, thus far, operating amid class antagonisms, needed the state, that is, an organization of the particular exploiting class for the maintenance of its external conditions of production, and thereby, especially, for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited class in the conditions of oppression determined by the given mode of production, that being slavery, or serfdom, or bondage, or wage labor. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, its concentration in a visible corporation. But it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which itself represented for its own time society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens, in the Middle Ages of the feudal nobility, in our own time of the bourgeoisie. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. As soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon the present anarchy in production, with the collisions and excesses arising from this struggle, are removed, nothing more remains to be held in subjection. Nothing necessitating a special coercive force, a state. The first act by which the state really comes forward as the representative of the whole of society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, is also its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies down of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of process of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase, a free people's state, both as to its justifiable use for a long time from an agitational point of view, and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the so-called anarchists' demand that the state be abolished overnight. Lenin says, it is safe to say that of this argument of Engels, which is so remarkably rich in details, in ideas rather, only one point has become an integral part of socialist thought among modern socialist parties, namely that, according to Marx, that the state withers away, as distinct from the anarchist doctrine of the abolition of the state. To prune Marxism to such an extent means reducing it to opportunism, for this interpretation only leaves a vague notion of a slow, even gradual change, of absence of leaps and storms, of absence of revolution. The current widespread popular, if one may say so, conception of the withering away of the state undoubtedly means obscuring, if not repudiating, revolution. Such an interpretation, however, is the crudest distortion of Marxism, advantageous only to the bourgeoisie. In its theory, it's based on disregard for the most important circumstances and considerations indicated in, say, Engels's summary argument we have just quoted in full. In the first place, at the very outset of his argument, Engels says that in seizing state power, the proletariat thereby abolishes the state as state. It is not done to ponder over the meaning of this. Generally, it is either ignored altogether or is considered to be something in the nature of Hegelian weakness on Engels's part. As a matter of fact, however, these words briefly express the experience of one of the greatest proletarian revolutions, the Paris Commune of 1871, of which we shall speak in greater detail in its proper place. As a matter of fact, Engels speaks here of the proletariat revolution abolishing the bourgeois state, while the words about the state withering away refer to the remnants of the proletarian state after the socialist revolution. This must be a typo, proletariat revolution. According to Engels, the bourgeois state does not wither away, but is abolished by the proletariat in the course of the revolution. It's not a button you push. What withers away after this revolution is the proletarian state, or semi-state. Secondly, the state is a special coercive force. Engels gives this splendid and extremely profound definition here with the utmost lucidity. And from it follows that the special coercive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, of millions of working people by handfuls of the rich, must be replaced by a special coercive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. That is, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Just going to say this. If that idea scares you, I don't think you're a socialist. You're probably just a liberal. You may think you support socialism, but you don't support the conditions upon which socialism arises. So you're not really a socialist. If you're scared and if you don't want a so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, you're not a socialist. Step aside. Get out of the way. Reading on, Lenin says, this is precisely what is meant by abolition of the state as state. This is precisely the act of taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. And it is self-evident that such a replacement of one bourgeois special force by another proletarian special force cannot possibly take place in the form of withering away. Thirdly, in speaking of the state withering away, an even more graphic and colorful dying down of itself, Engels refers quite clearly and definitely to the period after the state has taken possession of the means of production in the name of the whole of society. That is, after the socialist revolution. We all know that the political form of the state at that time is the most complete democracy. But it never enters the head of any of the opportunists who shamelessly distort Marxism that Engels is consequently speaking here of democracy dying down of itself or withering away. You think, They're saying Engels wants democracy to go away. This seems very strange at first sight, but it is incomprehensible only to those who have not thought about democracy also being a state, and consequently also disappearing when the state disappears. Revolution alone can abolish the bourgeois state. The state in general, that is, the most complete democracy, can only wither away. Fourthly, after formulating his famous proposition that the state withers away, Engels at once explains specifically that this proposition is directed against both the opportunists and the anarchists. In doing this, Engels puts in the forefront that conclusion, drawn from the proposition that the state withers away, which is directed against the opportunists. One can wager that out of every 10,000 persons who have read or heard about the withering away of the state, 9,990 are completely unaware or do not remember that Engels directed his conclusions from a proposition not against anarchists alone. And of the remaining 10, probably 9 do not know the meaning of a free people's state, or why an attack on this slogan means an attack on opportunists. That is how history is written, how a great revolutionary teaching is imperceptibly falsified and adapted to prevailing Philistinism. The conclusion directed against the anarchists has been repeated thousands of times. It has been vulgarized and rammed into people's heads in the shallowest form, and has acquired the strength of a prejudice, whereas the conclusion directed against the opportunists has been obscured and forgotten. The Free People's State was a program demand and a catchword current among the German Social Democrats in the 70s. This catchword is devoid of all political content, except that it describes the concept of democracy in a pompous Philistine fashion. Insofar as it hinted in a legally permissible manner at a democratic republic, Engels was prepared to justify its use for a time, from an agitational point of view. But it was an opportunist catchword, for it amounted to nothing more than prettifying bourgeois democracy, and was also a failure to understand the socialist criticism of the state in general. We are in favor of a democratic republic as the best form of the state for the proletariat under capitalism. But we have no right to forget that wage slavery is the lot of the people, even in the most democratic bourgeois republic. Furthermore, every state is a special force for the suppression of the oppressed class. Consequently, every state is not free and not a people's state. Marx and Engels explained this repeatedly to their party comrades in the 70s. Fifthly, the same work of Engels, whose arguments about the withering away of the state everyone remembers, also contains an argument of the significance of violent revolution. Engels' historical analysis of its role becomes a veritable panegyric on violent revolution. This no one remembers. It is not done in modern socialist parties to talk or even think about the significance of this idea, and it plays no part whatsoever in their daily propaganda and agitation among the people. And yet, it is inseparably bound up with the withering away of the state into one harmonious whole. We have a question from chat. What does Philistine mean in this context? He's calling them dummies. I know it's not a great word, but he's saying they're lightweights. I don't know. Let's put it this way. He says they haven't done the reading. So, let's get back to the reading. Lenin says, here is Engels's argument. That force, however, plays yet another role other than that of a diabolical power in history, a revolutionary role. That, in the words of Marx, it is the midwife of every old society which is pregnant with a new one. That it is the instrument with which social movement forces its way through and shatters the dead, fossilized political forms. Of this, there is not a word in Herr Düring. It is only with sighs and groans that he admits the possibility that that force will perhaps be necessary for the overthrow of an economy based on exploitation. Unfortunately, because all the use of force demoralizes, he says, the person who uses it. And this in Germany, where a violent collision, which may after all be forced upon the people, would at least have the advantage of wiping out the servility which has penetrated the nation's mentality following the humiliation of the 30 Days' War. And this person's mode of thought, dull, insipid, and impotent, presumes to impose itself upon, on the most revolutionary party that history has ever known. And we'll give a little background here. The 30 Years' War, 1618 and 1648, the First European War, resulted from an aggravation of the antagonisms between various alignments of European states, took the form of a struggle between Protestants and Catholics. Began with a revolt in Bohemia against the tyranny of the Habsburg monarchy and the onslaught of Catholic reaction. The states which then entered the war formed two camps. The Pope, the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs, and the Catholic princes of Germany, who rallied to the Catholic Church, opposed the Protestant countries, Bohemia, Denmark, Sweden, the Dutch Republic, and a number of German states that had accepted the Reformation. The Protestant countries were backed by the French kings, enemies of the Habsburgs. Germany became the chief battlefield and object of military plunder and predatory claims. The war ended in 1648 with the signing of the peace treaty of Westphalia, which completed the political dismemberment of Germany. Lenin says, how can this panegyric on violent revolution, which Engels insistently brought to the attention of the German Social Democrats between 1878 and 1894, that is, right up to the time of his death, be combined with the theory of the withering away of the state to form a single theory? Usually, the two are combined by means of eclecticism, by an unprincipled or sophistic selection made by arbitrarily, or to please the powers that be, of first one, then another argument, and in 99 cases out of 100, if not more, it is the idea of the withering away that is placed in the forefront. Dialectics are replaced by eclecticism. This is the most usual, the most widespread practice to be met with in present-day official social democratic literature in relation to Marxism. This sort of substitution is, of course, nothing new. It was observed even in the history of classical Greek philosophy. In falsifying Marxism in opportunist fashion, the substitution of eclecticism for dialectics is the easiest way of deceiving the people. It gives an illusory satisfaction. It seems to take into account all sides of the process, all trends of development, all the conflicting influences, and so forth, whereas in reality it provides no integral and revolutionary conception of the process of social development at all. We've already said above, and we shall show more fully later, that the theory of Marx and Engels of the inevitability of a violent revolution refers to the bourgeois state. The latter cannot be superseded by the proletarian state, or the dictatorship of the proletariat through the process of withering away, but as a general rule, only through a violent revolution. The panegyric, which is like what? It's like a big speech or something that someone gives. The panegyric Engels sang in its honor, and which fully corresponds to Marx's repeated statements, see the concluding passages of the Poverty of Philosophy and the Communist Manifesto with their proud and open proclamation of the inevitability of a violent revolution, see what Marx wrote nearly 30 years later in criticizing the Gotha program of 1875 when he mercilessly castigated the opportunist character of that program. Again, and which fully corresponds to Marx's repeated statements, this panegyric is by no means a mere impulse, a mere declamation, or a polemical sally. A great name for a band, by the way. Write that down in your notebook. The necessity of systematically imbuing the masses with this, and precisely this point of view of violent revolution, lies at the root of the entire theory of Marx and Engels. The betrayal of their theory by the now prevailing social chauvinist and Kautskyite trends expresses itself strikingly in both these trends, ignoring such propaganda and agitation. The supersession, of the bourgeois state by the proletarian state is impossible without a violent revolution. The abolition of the proletarian state, that is, of the state in general, is impossible except through the process of a withering away. A detailed and more concrete elaboration of these views was given by Marx and Engels when they studied each particular revolutionary situation, when they analyzed the lessons of the experience of each particular revolution. We shall now pass to this, undoubtedly the most important part of their theory. And that was today's reading of Chapter 1 of The State and Revolution. Chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State. I hope you enjoyed this reading and discussion with my jokes and comments mixed in throughout. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm just going to mute that for a second. I want to thank you so much for being with me. If you enjoyed this content, if you got something out of it, and if you got a couple bucks laying around, please consider supporting. It does mean a lot. Please help me keep this independent communist media alive. Really appreciate you. Thank you all so much for being with me and doing the work in raising your own revolutionary consciousness. Good for you. I'm proud of you. We'll see you next time on Chapter 2. Chapter 2, the experience of 1848 to 1851. If you are watching live on the Twitch stream, stick around. If you're watching the replay, check out Chapter 2 or something else from the Read Aloud series. Love your face.